Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, today, we want to have a look at the entire battlefield running from Kupiansk all the way to the south towards the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporizhia. But recently, there has been a Russian offensive operation within the Kupiansk sector. This is this area here. If we kind of scroll out, we can see just where that is. It's in the northeastern quadrant of the battle space. We'll zoom in here. And what I want to do next is give you an idea of the movement of Russian forces, the breakthrough that has occurred in this sector. The elements of the Russian 1st Guards Tank Army are operating in this sector. We have seen some very large-scale armored operations take place against Ukrainian forces. Obviously, we're still seeing the massive use of Russian heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems. That has taken the greatest toll on Ukrainian forces, is the artillery and the rising use of Russian drone activity. These are both human-controlled drones and the newer AI, artificial intelligence-controlled drones that have the ability to select a target on the ground and then attack that target, even when the Ukrainians are using some fairly advanced Western electronic warfare systems that are designed to eliminate the man in the loop and disable the ability of the drone pilot to see what he's attacking. These autonomous systems, these fully autonomous systems, are able to attack targets on their own. And we know the newer versions of the Lancet, which also have thermal imaging optics, are also now using more advanced artificial intelligence systems that are able to self-guide themselves and attack Ukrainian targets. Now, if we have a look at some of the units, we'll start at the kind of the northwestern quadrant here. The 138th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 25th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 2nd Motorized Rifle Division from the 1st Guards Tank Army, 47th Guards Tank Division from the 1st Guards Tank Army, 7th Motorized Rifle Regiment from the 18th Motorized Division, the 27th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade. So you have a host of very large Russian units that are involved in this operation, running from just to the north all the way to the south of Kupiansk. And now what we want to do is we want to have a look at territorial gains, some of the breakthroughs that have been made by Russian forces in this ongoing counteroffensive by Russian troops. So we're essentially going to go back let's go back to the January 5th, and we can then watch what has slowly occurred over the last few weeks in regards to this ongoing offensive by Russian forces. And keep your eye down here in the southern sector of what eventually happens. So again, you can see this is where the focal point of the Russian offensive started. You can see this area became an engagement zone. It became grayed out. And then finally, the Russian breakthrough. And there are operations taking place. Let's go back here. You can see the Russians forward deploying its forces and then launching their attack. Now we're also continuing to see the deterioration of the Avdiivka cauldron. This is now being broken up into multiple pieces by Russian forces. You can see this breakthrough that has occurred down here in the southern sector, followed by another salient of Russian forces that actually penetrated the main defensive barrier of Ukrainian troops and are now operating in the southern southeastern quadrant of the city. There also continues to be pressure to both the south and the north as the Russians continue to tighten their grip on Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka. And again, the primary use of heavy artillery and drone systems are continuing to take a devastating toll on Ukrainian forces, continuing to try to hold out for Avdiivka. And finally, I want to go down into the southern sector where we originally saw this Ukrainian counteroffensive. If you remember, the Ukrainians had claimed to have broken through and captured the main Russian defensive belt that is just to the north by northeast of Tokmak. Now you can see that the Russians have strengthened these defensive belts. They have enhanced their position. They have counterattacked in these areas, driving out Ukrainian forces from the southern Zaporizhzhia sector. Remember, the Ukrainian forces at one point, at least with the deep state map, controlled areas all the way down to this line of fortifications and trenches, just to the southeast of Robatna in this area here. And matter of fact, let's just go back and we can kind of show you how this changed over the course of several weeks. And as the Ukrainians talk about a renewed counteroffensive, this is going to be very challenging because they're going to be going back and essentially trying to retake the same areas that they at one point sort of controlled, and they have lost all this ground. So again, this is where the Ukrainians really became enthusiastic about allegedly breaking into the Russian main defensive belt. This is this area here. Now, the challenge for the Ukrainians back in the summer was once they penetrated this belt, there was an additional layers of defensive belts to the south, and then finally the main strong points near Tokmak and even further to the south with the Russian Mobile Reserve that was building up here in the southeast as well. And these are large reserve formations that are also directly supported by the 42nd Motorized Rifle Division. But if we fast forward this now and we look at what exactly happened in this southern sector as the Ukrainians were pushed back and the Russians regained control of all this territory. And again, this wasn't really talked about in the mainstream media. It was never really reported by any of the sources here in the United States. You heard about the breach by Ukrainian forces of the Russian main defensive belt, which was this here, but you never heard about the Russians retaking it. And it was just kind of just went into the annals of history without even being discussed or even talked about. And if we fast forward it here, we're going to watch the Russians push forward, and that's the initial counterattack by Russian forces. And again, this is a Ukrainian-supported site that we're gaining this information from. So you can see a big fallback by Ukrainian forces. And remember, the much ballyhooed Ukrainian counteroffensive that talked about busting through the main Russian defensive belt. It was talked about a lot. But this, what happened in the south of Zaporizhzhia, not discussed at all. And that's kind of where we sit now as the Russians continue to pressure this area. And eventually, I would tend to have to say that eventually this bulge, this remaining bulge, will completely just disappear and will no longer exist. The current length of it is 8 kilometers. Let's call it 8 kilometers, about 4 miles. And that was the extent of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now remember, that counteroffensive was cataclysmic for the Ukrainian military. They lost upwards to 500 to 600 vehicles of various sorts, most of which were armored vehicles, mine-resistant armored vehicles, a host of other Western vehicles, from Bradleys to Leopard 2s, to other systems such as the CV-90s and other systems, and a host of Soviet air systems as well, and Ukrainian systems that the Ukrainians had built themselves, such as BMPs, various sorts, T-64s, captured Russian T-72 Bravo 3s, other T-72s, T-80s were destroyed in this counteroffensive. Essentially, an entire reinforced Western division of equipment annihilated in this offensive operation by the Ukrainians. Again, 500 to 600 armored vehicles, thousands of troops killed and wounded, and the Russians believe tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops killed or wounded in this southern Zaporizhzhia offensive, which, again, if you remember, the original goal was the initial baseline goal was to proceed south, seize control of Tokmak, and then move on down to Melitopol, this objective here, and then eventually separate Russian forces from Crimea to the land corridor over here in Novorossiya. Additionally, the second phase of the operation was an amphibious operation designed to then land on the eastern bank or the left bank of the Dnieper River, and then enhancing that pressure campaign or that counteroffensive by the Ukrainians to then roll up into the southern Kherson area of operations, and then finally see the defeat of Russian Federation forces in both Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. That was the goal. It obviously didn't happen. The Zelensky leadership decided to go ahead and launch this ill-fated amphibious operation to try and alleviate some of the bad press narratives that were coming from the failed operation in Zaporizhzhia. And that operation has led to the death of hundreds of Ukrainian naval infantry forces and wounding of Ukrainian naval infantry forces operating on the the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. So again, it had no impact on the actual conflict. It had no impact on the failed offensive to the east whatsoever. And it really kind of gives you an insight of some of the poor decision-making processes that have come out of Kiev in regards to the civilian political apparatus trying to get its hands into the conflict and try and manipulate the military narrative and control the military narrative, which they've not been very successful at thus far. So that's kind of where we sit as of today. We will continue to monitor. We will continue to report. Thank you for joining us. And more to come very, very soon, as always. Have a good day.